Hello, everyone. I am the sleep storyteller, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before we begin, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps out a lot. Also, let me know in the comments, where are you from and what time are you listening? Now get comfortable and relax. The wind whispered through the ancient pines, carrying with it the scent of frost and the hushed secrets of a world older than memory. The night stretched long and cold, the sky a canvas of shimmering stars that blinked like distant, knowing eyes. Far beyond the lands of men, where the rivers turned to ice and the breath of winter lingered eternal, an old tale waited to be told. Tonight, as the embers of the hearth glowed with quiet warmth, the story of the long night and the watchers who stood against it would unfold once more, long before the seven kingdoms were ever carved from the bones of Westeros, before lords and banners and the Iron Throne. There was an age of darkness. It was a time when the world was wilder, its lands untouched by the hands of kings, and its skies thick with magic. The first men, the earliest known inhabitants of Westeros, had not always been here. They came from across the narrow waters, their bronze swords glinting under the pale sun, their horses stamping across the land bridge known as the Arm of Dorne. They were a people of strength and will, hardened by the elements, bound by honor and blood. But the land they sought to claim was not empty. Deep in the heart of the great forests and the valleys untouched by time, the children of the forest had dwelled for thousands of years. They were small and slight, with eyes that glowed like polished jade and hair the color of autumn leaves. They wove their lives into the very fabric of the woods, living in harmony with the weirwood trees, whose white bark bore solemn, carved faces. The children did not build great cities, nor raise stone walls. They lived in the shadows of the earth, whispering to the old gods through the faces of their sacred trees. Their power was not of steel or brute force, but of something older, something woven into the very bones of the land. They wielded the gifts of green-seeing, of speaking to beasts, of calling upon the will of nature itself. When the first men arrived, they did not come as guests. They were conquerors, bringing with them the sharp bite of axes and the fire of war. They felled the sacred weirwoods, carving into the land as if it were theirs to command. The children, unseen but never powerless, struck back. The war that followed was long and bitter, fought not just with swords, but with sorcery. The rivers ran red with blood, the forests burned, and the earth trembled under the weight of their battle. But war is a costly thing, and after generations of strife, both sides saw the futility of endless fighting. On the Isle of Faces, where the godswood stood thick and ancient, a peace was forged the pact. The first men swore to cease their destruction of the weirwoods, to honor the land and the gods of the children. In return, the children allowed them to keep the lands they had taken. It was not a surrender, but a balance, a way for both peoples to endure. Over time, the first men took on the ways of the children, forsaking their old gods and and swearing themselves to the nameless, faceless deities who watched through the eyes of the trees. And for a time, there was peace. But peace is fragile, and beyond the reach of men, something darker stirred. Far in the frozen wastes of the farthest north, where even the first men did not tread, an ancient and terrible force lay waiting. The songs and stories would call them many names, the others, the White Walkers, the cold shadows of the night. What they were before they came, none could say. But when they did, the world knew fear unlike any it had ever known. The first signs were whispers carried by the wind, the kind that sent shivers down the spines of hunters and made mothers clutch their children tighter in the night. Then came the frost, creeping down from the north, unnatural in its reach, seeping into the bones of the earth. The skies darkened, the sun fatting behind a shroud of endless winter. It was the long night, a darkness that stretched for a generation, where children were born and died without ever seeing the light of day. And in that darkness, they came, tall and gaunt, with eyes like ice blue fire. The White Walkers moved through the frozen lands, gliding over the snow without a sound, their breath curling in the air like mist. Their swords were not of steel, but of something else, something colder, sharper, that could slice through iron and flesh alike. Where they passed, the dead did not stay dead. Corpses rose, hollow and unfeeling, their empty eyes glistening with a terrible, unnatural light. Armies of the fallen moved in their wake, bound by some dark, that no living man could understand. The people of Westeros, unprepared and disbelieving, fell before them like wheat before the scythe. Villages vanished beneath the snow, their inhabitants lost to ice and shadow. The great houses of the north, strong as they were, could not stand against the tide of death that swept from the frozen lands. The first men, who had thought themselves rulers of the land, now found themselves hunted, their swords shattering against the unnatural blades of their enemies. But even in the deepest darkness, there is always a spark of fire. Legends speak of a last hero, a warrior who set forth to find salvation. His name is lost to time, but his story remains. He walked through the frozen lands, his sword turning brittle in the cold, his companions falling one by one. His horse died beneath him, his hound lost to the endless night. Alone, he pressed on, seeking the only ones who might know how to turn the tide, the children of the forest. And at the edge of despair, when all seemed lost, he found them. What knowledge they shared, what power they offered, the stories do not say. But when the hero returned, he did not come empty-handed. He came with fire, with weapons of dragon glass, with the wisdom of the children woven into the steel of men. And with those gifts, humanity fought back. The battle for the dawn, they called it. The great war that drove the White Walkers from the lands of men, pushing them back beyond the frozen wastes. No man could say if they were defeated or merely turned away. But when the battle was done, the first men and the children raised a barrier that would stand for thousands of years, the wall, 100 leagues long, 700 feet high, woven not just of ice, but of magic. wall stood as the last defense against the return of the darkness. And to guard it, the Night's Watch was born, sworn brothers who would stand eternal vigil against the threat beyond. The long night had ended, but winter would always come again. And as the embers of firelight flickered in the hearth, the old stories whispered that the war was not over, only waiting. The wall stood tall against the sky, a colossal monument of ice and sorcery that stretched beyond the eye's reach. It was more than stone and frost. It was a boundary between worlds, a line drawn against the horrors that lurked in the eternal cold. The men who stood upon it, the sworn brothers of the Night's Watch, were its guardians. They were the watchers on the wall, the shield that guarded the realms of men. But time is cruel to even the strongest of foundations. And as the centuries passed, the watch itself began to wither. Just as men's belief in the old threats faded into myth, it had not always been this way. In the earliest days, the Night's Watch was an order of honor, its ranks filled with warriors of noble blood, second sons who chose duty over inheritance, men who saw the watch as a calling. The castles along the wall were strongholds of power, housing thousands of black-cloaked sentinels. 19 fortresses dotted the frozen expanse, each manned by warriors who understood that the wall was more than just a structure. It was the last defense against the forgotten darkness. But generations passed, and memories dulled. The White Walkers had not been seen since the long night, and slowly, men ceased to believe they had ever truly existed. What need was there for an army to guard against a fairy tale? The noble houses stopped sending their sons to the watch. The fortresses along the wall fell silent, abandoned one by one, until only 3 remained manned Castle Black, Eastwatch by the Sea, and the Shadow Tower. The Night's Watch became something else, something lesser. Instead of warriors of honor, its ranks were filled with the unwanted criminals, thieves, exiles, and bastards. Lords sent their disgraced kin to the wall rather than let them stain their family names. The prisons of Westeros emptied into the watch. Their inhabitants offered the choice: take the black or face the executioner's blade. Few ever came willingly, and even fewer saw it as a place of glory. But duty remained. Even as the world forgot the watch's purpose, the sworn brothers kept their oaths. By fire and by frost, they stood upon the wall, watching the endless tundra beyond, never knowing what might one day rise from the snow. Yet, even within the watch, legends persisted. There were whispers of an ancient figure, a name long erased from history, the Night's King. He had been the 13th Lord Commander, a man who had once sworn the same oaths as the rest. But his fate was darker than any who had come before or after him. The tale, as told by the oldest of the Black Brothers, spoke of a night when the Lord Commander looked down from the wall and saw her, a woman unlike any other. Her skin was pale as the snow, her eyes burning blue with an unearthly fire. She was no creature of flesh and blood, but something else, something born of the cold. And yet, he was drawn to her. He rode beyond the wall, chasing after the pale woman, and when he found her, he gave himself to her utterly. What words were spoken, what dark promises exchanged, no one could say. But when he returned to the night fort, he was no longer a man of the watch. He was a king, and she was his queen. For 13 years, he ruled from the night fort, twisted by sorcery, and bound to a power no man should have wielded. He and his corpse queen bent the watch to their will, warping it into something terrible. It was said that the night's king committed horrors unseen, sacrificing to the dark forces beyond the wall, giving the others their due. His name was stripped from history, his deeds buried in silence. It was only when Brandon the Breaker, king in the north, and the king beyond the wall joined forces that the night's king was cast down. His reign ended in fire and blood, and the night fort was abandoned, its halls left to the ghosts of what had transpired. And so the story was passed down, not in records, but in whispers. Some claimed it was mere myth, a fable to frighten new recruits. Others believed it held a warning, one that men had long since chosen to ignore. For if the night's king had truly bound himself to the White Walkers, then it meant that once, long ago, men and the others had not been so far apart. But even as the legend of the night's king faded, another tale endured, one far greater, one that spanned beyond the cold lands of the north and into the forgotten corners of the world, in the distant east, beyond the narrow sea, where golden palaces rose above ancient rivers, and the bones of empires lay buried beneath time's endless march. There was another legend of the long night. And in that tale, the battle against the darkness was not waged by a last hero of the first men, but by a warrior whose name had never been forgotten, Azur Ahai. It was said that in the age of darkness, when the sky had turned black and the cold breath of night sought to claim the world, a hero was chosen by fate. Azur Ahai knew that he alone could stand against the coming shadow, but to do so, he would need a weapon, a blade that could drive back the endless dark. For 30 days and 30 nights, he labored over his forge, shaping steel with hammer and fire. When at last his blade was ready, he tempered it in water. But as the steel touched the surface, it shattered. Undeterred, he began again. This time, he worked for 50 days and 50 nights, crafting the sword anew. When it was finished, he sought to strengthen it by driving it into the heart of a lion. But again, the blade broke. A third time, he forged the weapon, toiling for 100 days and nights. He knew now that the sword could not be tempered by mere beasts or water. It needed something greater, something far more precious. And so, when the blade was ready, he turned to his beloved wife, Nissa. He called her before him, and as she gazed into his eyes, she understood what must be done. With trembling hands, Azur Ahai drove the sword into her heart. The steel drank her life, her soul, her very essence, and in that moment, the blade blazed with fire. It burned with the light of her sacrifice, And so was born Lightbringer, the red sword of heroes. With Lightbringer in hand, Azur Ahai faced the darkness, driving back the shadows and restoring the world to light. But even victory is fleeting. The prophecy that followed foretold that one day, when the darkness rose again, Azur Ahai would return, a warrior reborn beneath a bleeding star, wielding a burning sword to once again fight the coming night. And so the legend spread, whispered by red priests in the great temples of Volantes, passed from lips to ears in the shadowed streets of Asai. Some believed he had already returned. Some sought him in kings and princes, searching for the one who would stand against the cold once more. But as the centuries turned and the world moved forward, the truth of the prophecy remained uncertain. Had Azur Ahai been real? Had Lightbringer truly burned with fire? Or was it, like so many things, just another tale woven into the great tapestry of myth? The answer, perhaps, lay in the bloodlines of kings. For while the warriors of the past had long since turned to dust, their legacy endured. And in the frozen halls of Winterfell, where hot springs bubbled beneath stone, and the words of House Stark echoed through the ages, that legacy waited to be awakened, because winter was coming, and when it did, the world would remember. The winds howled through the north, rattling the high towers of Winterfell, and sweeping across the vast, snow-covered expanse beyond the wall. The cold had a way of settling deep into the bones, a lingering reminder that winter was never truly gone. It merely slept, waiting for the right moment to wake. And when it did, the world would once again tremble beneath its icy grasp. But there were those who had never forgotten. For thousands of years, House Stark had ruled the North, their words not a boast or a call to arms, but a warning. Winter is coming. Other great houses fashioned their mottos as declarations of power. Baratheons spoke of fury, Lannisters of debt, Greyjoys of conquest. But the Starks, theirs was not about ambition. It was a promise, a reminder that no matter how warm the summers, no matter how many years passed, the cold would return. And when it did, it would bring death with it. The Starks were different from the other noble families of Westeros. They traced their bloodline back to the first men, untouched by the Andals, who had conquered the South with their 7 gods and golden steel. They still worshipped the old gods, kneeling before the ancient weirwoods, listening to the whispers of the leaves in the wind. Beneath the red boughs of the Winterfell godswood, the great heart tree stood with its solemn face carved deep into the pale white bark, its eyes bleeding red sap like tears. Legends spoke of their founder, Bran the Builder, a figure as much myth as history. It was said he had raised Winterfell's walls and shaped the foundations of the wall itself, working alongside the children of the forest to weave their magic into the ice. Some whispered that his line carried a touch of that magic still, an old power that slept in the blood of the Starks, waiting for the right time to stir. But magic was not something the world embraced anymore. The South had long turned away from the myths of the past. choosing reason over whispers of prophecy, steel over sorcery. The citadel of the Meisters, the great keepers of knowledge, dismissed the tales of the long night as mere stories, cautionary fables meant to explain the hardships of ancient winters. The White Walkers, the others, nothing more than the nightmares of old crones and wildlings. But the North remembered, even if the White Walkers had vanished beyond the wall, even if the long night was a tale buried under 1,000 years of history, the Starks still held their vigil. They ruled with honor, with justice, with the steady, unyielding patience of those who knew that time moved in cycles. One day, the wall might stand empty, forgotten by those who had come to believe in the safety of their castles. But the North would always be watching, and beneath Winterfell, the dead kept their silent watch as well. The crypts of Winterfell ran deep, a labyrinth of stone and shadow stretching far beneath the castle itself. Here, the lords of Winterfell rested, their statues standing solemn over their tombs, great stone wolves at their feet, swords of iron laid across their laps. The swords were not merely for ceremony, they were placed there for a reason. It was said that the dead did not always rest easy in the North. The oldest tales whispered of something sealed away in the depths of the crypts, something the Starks had been guarding since the Age of Heroes. Perhaps it was only legend, a tale to frighten children and wandering fools. But if it were true, then it meant the Starks had been preparing for something far older and far darker than even the lords of the South could imagine. Beyond the wall, beyond the realm of men, something stirred. The frost crept lower, the night stretched longer, and the wind carried with it a whisper, a promise of cold death, waiting to return. But Westeros was not the only land that remembered. Far to the east, beyond the Dothraki Sea and the ruins of Valyria, there lay another kingdom, one far older than the Seven Kingdoms. It was a land of golden palaces and river-fed cities, a place where emperors once ruled with the power of the gods themselves. It was known as Yeti, the remnants of what had once been the great empire of the Dawn. If Westeros had its legends of the long night, then Yeti had its own, and its tale was even more ominous. The histories of the East spoke of a time when the sky went black, when the sun vanished behind a shroud of ash and shadow. The night stretched for generations, and in that darkness, monsters walked the earth. But unlike the story of the last hero, or Azor Ahai, the people of Yeti remembered why the long night had come. It had been a punishment. The gods, angered by the arrogance and wickedness of mankind, had cast the world into darkness. Their wrath had been ignited by the betrayal of one man, the Bloodstone Emperor. Once, the great empire of the Dawn had ruled with wisdom and peace. Its emperors had descended from celestial beings, their reigns long and prosperous. But in time, the line grew weaker, greedier, more corrupt. And then came the last of them, the Amethyst Empress, a ruler who should have guided her people into a new age of light. but her younger brother coveted her throne. The Bloodstone Emperor, as he came to be known, was no ordinary usurper. He was cruel and mad, a man who delved into sorcery long forbidden by the gods. He turned away from the celestial order and worshipped something far older, something dark. He took a black stone that had fallen from the sky and built his throne upon it, proclaiming himself a god in his own right. The rites he performed were terrible. Human sacrifice, necromancy, arts of blood and shadow. He called upon the darkness, and the darkness answered. And so, the gods turned their faces away. The long night was not merely a time of winter and suffering. It was the wrath of the heavens, a curse upon the world for the sins of men. Only through the deeds of a great hero, a woman with a monkey's tail, the stories claimed, was the world restored to light. The Bloodstone Emperor was overthrown, his reign struck from the records, his name cursed in every tongue. But the darkness he had called upon, that perhaps had never truly left. It was an unsettling thought, one that the red priests of our lore had long whispered of in the shadowed halls of Asai. If the long night had come once before, if it had been brought about by the hubris of men, then what was to stop it from happening again? And if the White Walkers, the others, were merely one piece of a much greater puzzle, then the battle for the dawn was far from over. As the fires burned low, and the cold winds howled outside the walls of Winterfell, the old legends murmured in the darkness, waiting for those who would listen. For winter was coming, and when it did, the world would stand upon the edge of shadow once more. The past had a way of lingering in the bones of the world, whispering through stone and ice, waiting to be remembered. And in the north, where the cold never truly left, and the wind carried echoes of ancient battles, history was not just something to be told, it was something that lived. The wall had stood for thousands of years, its frozen heights stretching farther than the eye could see, its foundation laid with ice and sorcery. The Night's Watch, the sworn guardians who patrolled its ramparts, were once men of honor and purpose. But time had worn them down, just as the years had worn down belief in the old threats. Beyond the wall, the free folk, whom the men of the south called wildlings, lived in scattered clans and villages, moving as the seasons dictated. They were not the monsters the lords of Westeros believed them to be, but they were hardened by the land, survivors of a world that had no mercy for the weak. They followed no king, no laws but their own. To them, the wall was not a shield, but a prison, a barrier built by southerners to keep them from lands that had once belonged to all men. But the wildlings had their own legends. Among them, the stories of the White Walkers had never been forgotten. The elders still spoke of the long night, of the cold shadows that had once crept down from the farthest north. They knew what the southerners did not, that the wall was not built to keep men out, but to keep something else from getting in. And some, the oldest among them, whispered that the signs had begun to return. The cold was creeping farther south, The winds carried a bite that was not natural. The dead were stirring in their graves, refusing to stay buried. Strange shadows moved in the distance, glimpsed only for a moment before vanishing into the snow. Something was waking, but the free folk were not the only ones who kept their eyes on the north. In the halls of Castle Black, where torches flickered against cold stone, where the banners of the Night's Watch hung tattered and forgotten, the Black Brothers continued their vigil. Their numbers had dwindled, their strength all but spent, but their oath remained. Asterisk night gathers, and now my watch begins. It was a vow that bound them beyond family, beyond kings, beyond the wars of the South. They were the last defense against a danger that no one believed in anymore, but not all of them doubted. There were some men who had stood on the wall long enough to feel the shift in the air, to hear the wind carry voices that had not spoken for centuries. They had seen things that could not be explained, things that did not belong to the world of the living. And then there were the old places, the abandoned castles along the wall, once filled with warriors, now stood empty, claimed only by ghosts and silence. The most infamous of them all was the Night Fort, once the greatest stronghold of the Night's Watch. It had long since fallen into ruin, its halls dark, its walls crumbling. No one lived there, and no one dared to, for the Night Fort had stories. There was the tale of the Rat Cook, a man who had broken the sacred guest rite, slaying the son of a king and baking him into a pie. The gods had cursed him, turning him into a monstrous thing that could never die, forced to feast on his own flesh for eternity. And then there was the asterisk black gate, asterisk, hidden deep in the well of the Night Fort's kitchens. It was not a door of stone or iron, but of weirwood, pale as bone, carved with the face of an ancient and solemn being. It did not open with a key or by force, but only to those who spoke the words of the Night's Watch oath. Some said it was the last true entrance to the world beyond, a door bound by the same magic that had raised the wall itself. But if that were true, then it meant the wall was more than ice and stone. It was something else entirely. The children of the forest had vanished long ago, retreating into the deep woods as men spread across the land. But their magic had never truly faded. The weirwood trees still stood, their faces carved in silent watchfulness. And for those who could listen, the whispers of the old gods still lingered in their branches. Some men had the gift. They were called asterisk greenseers, rare even among the first men. They could look through the eyes of the weirwoods, seeing across time itself. They could step into the minds of beasts, moving through the world with the senses of wolves, birds, even the great direwolves of the north. And there were rumors, always rumors, that the blood of greenseers had never fully died out. That in the oldest bloodlines, in the families who had never turned from the old gods, the gift still slept. Perhaps that was why the Starks had always been different. From the age of heroes to the present day, their line had endured. When other great houses rose and fell, the Starks remained. Winterfell had never been conquered, never truly broken. And if the old tales were to be believed, it was because their purpose had never been about crowns or power. It was about survival. In the deep crypts beneath Winterfell, where the dead of House Stark rested with their iron swords, there were whispers that something was buried there, something older than the castle itself. The iron swords were not placed on the tombs as mere decoration. They were meant to hold something at bay. And if the long night was truly returning, if the White Walkers were stirring beyond the wall, then the Starks might soon learn the truth of their own legacy. For winter was not just coming, it was already here. The North had always known hardship. It was a land where summers were short and cruel winters stretched on for years. Its people were not softened by luxury like the lords of the South. They did not build golden towers or whisper of courtly intrigues in perfumed halls. They lived by the old ways, by the certainty that the land could not be tamed, only endured. And in that endurance, they had carved out a kingdom that had stood for thousands of years. But endurance alone would not be enough for what was to come. Far beyond the wall, in the icy heart of the unknown, something ancient was stirring. The free folk had spoken of it in hushed voices, their stories dismissed by the Southrun lords as the ramblings of savages. But even among the wildlings, there were those who had seen things that defied explanation. Men who had gone into the frozen wastes never returned. Some who did came back changed, silent, hollow-eyed, muttering of figures that moved without sound, of ice-blue eyes starring from the darkness. The elders spoke of them as the White Walkers, the others, the silent death that walked on the breath of winter. Few believed them. The Night's Watch, once proud and powerful, had withered into little more than a collection of outcasts and criminals. They stood upon the wall, swearing their oaths and keeping their watch, but most had never truly believed in the purpose of their duty. The idea of the others had become nothing more than a ghost story, a tale to frighten new recruits. But ghosts have a way of returning. The first signs were subtle. The winds carried a sharper chill. The snows came earlier than expected. The cold lingered long after the sun had risen. But it was not until the bodies were found that the whispers turned to fear. The rangers of the Night's Watch who had gone beyond the wall had been missing for weeks. When they were found, their corpses lay frozen in the snow, their skin pale as ice, their eyes wide with an unnatural, glassy blue. And then, as night fell, they rose. The first attack came without warning. The dead did not move as men did. They did not breathe, did not feel, did not stop. Steel barely slowed them. Swords shattered against them like glass. It was fire that saved the watch that night. When the flames touched the risen dead, they burned with a terrible shriek, as if some unnatural force that that held them together was being torn apart. The night was filled with the stench of charred flesh, and the cries of men who had once stood upon the wall as brothers now turned into something else, something inhuman. The commander of the watch sent ravens south, calling for aid. But few lords of Westeros took the warnings seriously. They had wars of their own to fight. The South had always ignored the North, treating it as a place of little consequence, a land of cold and silence, where honor was a relic of the past. They did not understand that the North was not just a place. It was a shield, the last barrier between them and a force they could not comprehend. The free folk who had spent their lives fighting for survival beyond the wall understood. They had seen what lay in the heart of the cold, and they knew that if the White Walkers had returned, there would be no escaping them. But even as the South dismissed the warnings, even as the Night's Watch struggled to hold its crumbling order together, there were those who had begun to feel the weight of prophecy pressing down upon them. For the Red Priests of Arlor, who worshipped the Lord of Light, the return of the White Walkers was not merely a threat. It was a battle foretold in the flames. The priests spoke of Azor Ahai reborn, the prince that was promised, a warrior who would stand against the darkness with a blade of burning light. Some claimed that Stannis Baratheon, the brooding, unyielding claimant to the Iron Throne, was that prophesied savior. Others whispered that it was Jon Snow, the young bastard of Winterfell who had taken the black and sworn his life to the wall. But prophecy was a dangerous thing. The more one searched for its meaning, the more it twisted, turning upon itself like a snake devouring its own tail. And in the halls of Winterfell, where the crypts ran deep and the shadows stretched long, the weight of destiny was beginning to stir. The old bloodlines held secrets that even the Meisters did not fully understand. The Starks had always been different. Their bond with their direwolves, their strange dreams, the feeling that Winterfell itself was alive, watching, waiting. Some claimed it was mere superstition, but those who still listened to the old gods knew better. Magic had never truly left the world. It had only gone into hiding, waiting for the time when it would be needed again. And now that time was coming, as the fires burned low in the hearths of Winterfell, as the wind howled outside the walls, as the cold crept ever closer. The North prepared, for winter was no longer a warning. It was a reckoning, and the dawn, if it came at all, would be one with blood and fire. The cold was no longer just a whisper on the wind. It had crept into the bones of the land, tightening its grip with an unrelenting force. The nights stretched longer. The frost thickened on every blade of grass, and the people of the North, hardened as they were, felt an unease they could not name. For centuries, men had told themselves that the White Walkers were gone, that the long night was nothing more than a tale spun by old crones and superstitious fools. But there were always those who remembered. The free folk remembered, The watch remembered, and in the depths of Winterfell, beneath the towering walls of the ancient stronghold, the Starks had never forgotten. The crypts of Winterfell ran deep beneath the castle, carved into the earth in a time before records were kept. The great stone statues of past lords sat in solemn silence, iron swords laid across their laps. Those swords had not been placed as mere decoration. They had been placed for protection. Not to protect the dead, but to keep something buried beneath them. And now, the land itself was beginning to stir. The dreams had started again. They came to those who bore the old blood, those with the gift of sight, those who could hear the whispers of the past carried through the roots of the weirwood trees. In those dreams, the cold was alive, stretching across the land like a great hand, grasping, choking, pulling everything into darkness. And in the midst of that endless winter, they saw them, pale figures moving through the snow, their eyes burning like frozen fire. The White Walkers had returned. Beyond the wall, in the frozen wilds where the dead did not stay buried, the free folk were moving. Their villages had been abandoned, their people fleeing southward, desperate to escape the growing shadow. They had lived in the haunted lands beyond the wall for generations, enduring the harshest winters and the cruelest storms. But even they, fierce and unyielding as they were, had come to know fear. The Night's Watch, their numbers fewer than ever before, could do little to stop the tide of refugees. And yet, it was not the free folk they feared. It was what followed them. The dead were rising, not as men, not as the warriors they had been in life, but as something twisted, something bound to a will not their own. They did not tire, did not bleed, did not feel. And behind them, their masters watched with cold, silent eyes, gliding over the snow without leaving a trace. At Castle Black, the men of the Night's Watch had fought many things: wildlings, deserters, the bitter cold. But they had never fought anything like this. The first battle came in the dead of night, when the torches burned low and the wind screamed through the trees. They had believed the wall to be impenetrable, that its height and its strength would be enough. But the White Walkers did not need to climb. They did not need to break through gates or scale stone walls. The cold was their ally, and where it crept, death followed. The dead did not march like men. They did not break formation, did not hesitate, did not falter. They came as a wave, sweeping through the ranks of the living with a force that could not be stopped. The Night's Watch fought bravely, but bravery was not enough. Steel shattered against the weapons of the others, swords breaking like ice beneath the weight of their unnatural blades. And for every man who fell, another soldier was added to the enemy's ranks, their cold hands grasping for the brothers they had once stood beside. Only fire worked. The torches, the flaming arrows, the oil-soaked swords. These were the only weapons that held back the tide of death. When flame touched them, the dead burned like dry leaves, shrieking as the magic that bound them unraveled in the heat. But fire was fleeting, and the dead were not. The Night's Watch held the wall that night, but at great cost. Their numbers had been few to begin with, and now they were even fewer. Castle Black had survived, but barely, and south of the wall, in the halls of Winterfell, the ravens came. The North had always been a land of warriors, but no war in living memory had prepared them for what was coming. The lords of the great houses gathered, called by the old banners that had once stood against the storm so long ago. They spoke of battle, of steel and honor, of swords and shields, but none of that would matter if the dead could not be burned. The old ways had been forgotten by many, but there were still those who knew the truth. The weapons of men would not stop this war. Only fire, only dragon glass, only something older than the White Walkers themselves. And in the farthest corners of the world, where the ruins of fallen empires lay buried beneath time, there were whispers that the answer had already been foretold. The Red Priests of Arlor spoke of prophecy, the return of Azor-Ahai, the forging of Lightbringer, and as the world trembled beneath the weight of winter's return, the fires of prophecy burned brighter than ever. But prophecy was never clear. Some whispered that the prince who was promised would rise from the blood of Valyria, the ancient empire of dragons and fire. Others claimed the savior had already been born, hidden among kings and warriors, waiting for the time to reveal their destiny. The South still fought its petty wars, squabbling over crowns and thrones. But none of that would matter when the long night fell again, for winter was not simply a season. It was death, and it was already here. The ravens had flown south, carrying the warnings from the wall, their black wings slicing through the cold air. But the lords of Westeros were slow to listen. They sat in their halls of stone, wrapped in their fine cloaks, whispering of war and succession, of crowns and claims. Theirs was a world of banners and feuds, of debts and oaths. They had long since forgotten the true enemy, but the North had not. At Winterfell, beneath the gray banners of the direwolf, the lords of the North gathered. They came from the mountains and the valleys, from the frozen rivers and the deep woods. They were men who had weathered the worst that the world could offer, who had endured long winters and the cruelty of war. And yet, as they sat before the great hearth, listening to the words of the Night's Watch, even they felt the weight of fear pressing down upon them. The dead were moving, the White Walkers, the others. The cold shadows of the long night, they had returned, and the wall, that ancient shield of ice and magic, would not hold them forever. The South will not believe, Lord Manderly said, his heavy hands clenched upon the table. They will say it is wildling trickery, or the mad ravings of old men. They will believe when the dead are at their gates, said Lord Umber, his voice like the growl of a great beast. But by then, it will be too late. The lords turned to the head of the table, where the Warden of the North sat in silence. The firelight cast shadows across his face. The the solemn weight of his houses, words heavy in his mind. Winter is coming. The Starks had always known, even when the South laughed at their grim warnings, when the Meisters called the long night a myth. When the world forgot, the Starks had remembered, for they had built Winterfell not as a castle, but as a fortress against the cold. Beneath the stone walls, the crypts ran deep, carved into the earth in an age before memory. The statues of the old kings sat in silent vigilance, their iron swords resting upon their laps. It was said that those swords were meant to keep the dead in their graves, that the Starks had buried more than their ancestors beneath Winterfell. The old gods still watched from the heart tree in the godswood, their red eyes bleeding into the snow. The weirwoods did not forget. The land itself did not forget. And now the past was returning. Dragonglass, one of the Black brothers said, breaking the silence. His cloak was heavy with frost, his face worn with sleepless nights. It is the only thing that kills them. The lords exchanged uneasy glances. Dragonglass. The word carried the weight of old magic, of something long buried in the ruins of the world. It was rare, found only in the farthest reaches of the land, in places where fire had once burned hot enough to melt the earth. Where, the Warden of the North asked. Dragonstone, the Black brother answered. The old seat of House Targaryen. The name hung in the air like a specter. The Targaryens had come from fire. Their line descended from the dragon lords of Valyria, a people who had once bent the world to their will, with flame and blood. They had ruled Westeros for centuries, their dragons soaring above castles and battlefields, their sigil a three-headed beast wreathed in fire. But the dragons were gone. The last of them had died generations ago, their bones left to rot in the halls of kings. And yet, if the legends were true, their legacy remained. Dragonstone, the Warden of the North repeated, his gaze distant. Then we must send word. The Meisters would write the letters, the ravens would fly. But the South would not listen, not yet, because they were still fighting their own war. The Iron Throne, that jagged seat of melted swords, had always been the heart of conflict in Westeros. Kings and queens, usurpers and rebels, they had all bled for the right to sit upon it. And now, even as the true enemy gathered in the north, the South still fought over a prize that would not matter when the world turned to ice. But there were those who had begun to see the truth. Far to the east, in the shadowed lands beyond the narrow sea, the red priests of Arlor whispered of prophecy. The return of Azor Ahai, the warrior of fire who would stand against the darkness. Some believed he had already come. The priests spoke of a prince who was promised, a savior who would wield Lightbringer, the burning sword that had once driven back the long night. But prophecy was a cruel and fickle thing, twisting with time, its meaning never clear until the moment had passed. Some said the prince would be born among salt and smoke. Others claimed they had seen visions of him standing beneath a bleeding star, And then there were those who believed the answer had already been written in fire and blood. House Targaryen, the last remnants of Valyria, had always spoken of dragons returning to the world. Their words, *** fire and blood, were not just a war cry, but a promise. And if fire was the only thing that could stand against the cold, then the dragons, long thought extinct, might yet rise again. But the South still did not understand. They did not see the storm gathering beyond the wall, the darkness creeping closer with every passing day. They did not hear the whispers carried on the wind, the sound of ice cracking beneath the weight of something vast and unseen. The dead were marching, and unless the living stood together, unless they turned from their petty wars and ancient grudges, the long night would fall once more. Winter was not simply a season. It was a reckoning, and the dawn, if it ever came, would be one with fire or not at all. The night stretched long over the north, the cold deeper than it had been in generations. The sky above the wall was clear, but the stars burned with an eerie stillness, as if they too were holding their breath. Below, the men of the night's watch stood in silence upon the ramparts, their torches flickering against the vast emptiness beyond. The wind carried no sound, no whisper of life, only the heavy quiet of something waiting. The dead did not march as men did. They did not herald their arrival with drums or banners, with war cries or the clatter of steel. They came as the frost came, silent, inevitable. And as the long watch continued, the Black Brothers could feel it in their bones. The wall had stood for thousands of years, but it had never been tested like this. South of the wall, in the halls of Winterfell, the warnings had been received, but war had a way of blinding men to the greater battle ahead. The South fought over thrones and crowns, while the North whispered of shadows moving beyond the frozen wastes. The ravens carried messages of urgency, but who would listen? Dragonglass, fire. These were the weapons that could slay the dead, and yet the South was blind to the true war. At Dragonstone, where the sea crashed against the black cliffs, and the castle's towers rose like jagged fangs from the earth, the past stirred. The island had once been the seat of House Targaryen, the last remnants of the dragon lords of Valyria, who had come to Westeros centuries before with fire in their veins and dragons at their command. Now, Dragonstone held something far older than men's wars, buried deep beneath its darkened halls, in the caves where the ancient fire still whispered. The stone held secrets. Veins of dragonglass ran through the rock, untouched by time. The weapon that could stand against the White Walkers had been hidden here all along, waiting for those who would need it most. But weapons alone would not win this war. Beyond the wall, the free folk fled south in desperation, forced from their homes by something they could not fight. They had spent their lives battling the harsh elements, warring with each other, resisting the rule of kings. But now, for the first time, they had found a terror that made all those battles seem small. The White Walkers did not raid, did not pillage, did not leave the wounded behind. They came as a tide of cold and death, and those who fell did not stay dead. The free folk knew that if the wall fell, if the dead crossed into the lands of the living, there would be no stopping them. But still, the South did not believe, even as winter stretched its claws across Westeros, even as the cold seeped into every corner of the land. The lords of the great houses clung to their petty struggles. They spoke of crowns and betrayals, of battles fought in fields of red and gold. But the true war had already begun, and most of them had not even realized they were part of it. The red priests of Arlor saw glimpses in the flames, visions of ice swallowing the world, of a figure wielding fire against the coming night. The prophecy of Azor Ahai, the prince that was promised, burned in their minds. But prophecy was never clear. The signs spoke of a hero who would be reborn beneath a bleeding star, who would wield Lightbringer and drive back the darkness. Some believed he had already come. Others searched for him still, looking to kings and warriors, to fire and blood. And yet, the cold did not wait for prophecy. The first shadows had already crept past the wall. The dead were not waiting. As the cold wind howled through the forests of the north, the last fires of men burned low, and the long night loomed closer with every passing day. If they did not stand together, if they did not see the truth before it was too late, there would be no dawn. Only winter, only death. The first snows had begun to fall, blanketing the north in white, as if the land itself were preparing for the silence that would come. But there was no peace in the cold, only a creeping dread, a slow and inevitable descent into something ancient and terrible. At Castle Black, the brothers of the Night's Watch stood upon the wall, their breaths curling in the air like ghostly whispers. They had sworn an oath to stand against the darkness, to be the shield that guarded the realms of men. But how could a shield stop an enemy that did not break, did not yield, did not fear? Beyond the wall, the dead gathered in numbers too vast to count. Their eyes glowed with the eerie blue fire of unnatural will, their movements eerily smooth, silent, relentless. The free folk had fled before them, abandoning their villages, leaving behind everything they had ever known. But the dead did not need shelter. They did not need warmth. They did not stop. And soon, neither would the wall. For thousands of years, the wall had stood, a frozen monument to the last great war, to the battle that had driven the others back into the cold. It had been raised not just with ice, but with magic ancient spells woven into its foundation. Power that had endured even as the world forgot why it was needed. But magic, like all things, could fade. And deep in the heart of winter, the old spells were growing weak. At Winterfell, where the fires burned low, and the halls stood quiet beneath the heavy sky, the North prepared for war. Not the kind that was fought with banners and feasts, with swords and honor, This war would not be won by knights in shining armor, nor by great lords boasting of their bloodlines. This was a war against death itself. The lords of the north had answered the call, their banners gathering under the stark sigil of the direwolf. They had heard the warnings from the wall, had seen the free folk crossing south, their faces filled with something deeper than fear, something closer to knowing. But words alone could not prepare them. The legends spoke of weapons forged in fire, of blades that could cut through the unnatural ice of the others. Dragon steel, they called it in the oldest texts. Valyrian steel in the tongues of men. And deeper still, in the roots of the world, lay dragonglass, the obsidian forged in the heat of the earth itself. Dragonstone held such weapons. The old seat of House Targaryen, built atop the remnants of Valyria's lost fire. Its caves rich with the black glass that could slay the dead. But there were no dragons left, not since the last of them had died in a pit. Their once mighty wings shriveled to nothing, their fire gone from the world. The last dragon lords had fallen, their blood diluted, their magic fading into legend. And yet, if the old stories were true, fire would rise again. The Red Priests had seen visions in the flames, glimpses of the past repeating itself. A warrior would come, bearing a burning blade, a light against the coming darkness. Some believed Stannis Baratheon had been that warrior. Others whispered of Jon Snow, the bastard of Winterfell, a man who had taken the black and sworn himself to the watch. And then there were those who looked across the sea to the last daughter of Valyria's lost empire, the silver-haired queen who had risen from the ashes, Daenerys Targaryen. Fire and blood. If dragons still lived, if their fire could return to the world, then perhaps there was hope. But the dead did not wait for hope. They did not wait for prophecy. They did not wait for men to settle their wars and choose their leaders. The cold crept ever southward, seeping into the very bones of the land. The old gods were silent, the weirwoods standing still beneath the falling snow. Their red leaves the only color in an ever-bleaching world. Winter was here, and the last war had begun. The long night had begun. The wind howled through the frozen north, sweeping over the wall like a breath from the grave. The air was thick with the promise of snow, but this was no ordinary storm. This was something deeper, something older, something that did not belong to the world of men. The White Walkers stood in the darkness, their pale, cold eyes gleaming like distant stars. They did not rush, did not charge, did not shout. They simply waited, watching with an unshakable patience. The dead had no need for haste. They had already won. Atop the wall, the men of the Night's Watch prepared for a battle they could not win. They gripped their swords, knowing steel would shatter against the unnatural ice of the others. They lit their torches, knowing fire was their only salvation. And yet, in the deepest corners of their hearts, they felt it, that whisper of dread, that knowing. The wall had held for thousands of years. But tonight, the wall would fall. In the south, the great lords and kings played their games, shifting their armies like pieces on a board. They whispered of conquest, of vengeance, of legacy. But none of it would matter when the cold came for them. The Iron Throne, the wars of men, the feuds that had lasted generations, they were dust in the face of the true enemy. At Winterfell, the North braced itself. The great castle, built by Bran the Builder in the Age of Heroes, stood defiant against the storm. Its ancient stones warm with the heat of the natural springs beneath. But even the might of Winterfell, even the resilience of the Starks, could not stop what was coming. In the crypts, the statues of the old kings sat in silence, their iron swords laid across their laps. The stories claimed the swords were there to keep the dead in their graves, to hold back whatever slept beneath. But what if they did not? What if the dead did not stay dead? The Red Priests spoke of fire. The prophecy of Azor Ahai whispered of a warrior reborn, a savior who would stand against the darkness with a burning sword in hand. Some believed he had already risen. Others still searched. But the dead did not wait for prophecy. The first horn blast shattered the silence. One blast for rangers returning. 2 blasts for wildlings. 3 blasts. 3 blasts for the others. The sound echoed into the night, carrying with it a terror that words could not capture. The wall trembled. The ice groaned beneath unseen hands. And then, in the stillness that followed, the cold deepened. It was happening. The spells woven into the wall, the ancient magic that had held the others at bay for centuries, were breaking. The wall had been built to last forever, but nothing lasted forever. The first cracks formed, spiderwebbing through the frozen fortress. And then, with a sound like a mountain breaking in two, the ice shattered. The wall was falling. The watch had no time to react. Men screamed as the ice gave way beneath them, as the great barrier that had stood for thousands of years crumbled into ruin. The torches were swallowed by the snow, their light flickering and vanishing. And in the darkness, the dead came. They moved like a flood, pouring through the breach, an army of silent, frozen bodies. Their eyes burned with unnatural fire. Their weapons glowed with an icy sheen. They did not run. They did not roar. They simply advanced. Southward, to Winterfell, to the lands of the living, to the final war. Winter was here, and this time there would be no dawn.